Hello, students. Once again, I'm coming to you from my messy studio at home to talk to you about Chapter 3. We're getting into more modern times and into the period that's often called modernism. And what is modernism? That's a great question. Most people equate modernism with the Industrial Revolution, and that is about right because one can say we're shifting from in fact, we're past it already. We shifted from the Industrial Revolution and now we're in the technological revolution. And people call the period that we're in now postmodernism or after modernism. And modernism has a lot of other things that goes with it. So I'm going to be talking to you about that and how 20th century America and all the movements that were going on in the world and in art at that time were influencing African Americans who were making art. And these are a couple of words that are going to be on your vocabulary list for Chapter 3. So please take a look at that when you have a moment. I'm not going to define all of them now. They are defined on that sheet, and you will hear the definitions as we go through this slideshow. And as I mentioned before, I'm not going to read every single little slide. What I'm going to do is kind of rush through the historical part, just say, there's a lot of things that started happening, World War One, da 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 da, industrial wealth, lots of opportunities. Things were great for white people like Woodrow Wilson, not so great for black people, and the Great Depression was not a great time for anybody. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president of the United States during the Great Depression, and he helped put in a lot of policies in place that would help remedy it and also created some things that would benefit artists. And we're going to see a lot of that in this chapter. So it's important to know that the New Deal launched programs like the Federal Arts Program and the Works Project Administration. And then 12 years later, the United States entered World War II, and that is really significant. So I'm probably going to do a part one and a part two of chapter three because it's a huge chapter. There's over 100 slides in this, and I don't want to kill you with information. So the other thing that we see affecting artists right now is this notion of civil rights and double consciousness. And this photograph here by Harlem Renaissance photographer James Van Der Zee kind of summarizes everything. It's the Black Yankees. So we had a white Yankees and we had a black Yankees. We had a Negro baseball league. So people of African descent found themselves having this double consciousness that we're Americans, but we're not necessarily getting all the benefits of being Americans. And we've got two racial and ethnic identities, and all of this is, based on racism. The people talk about the biology of race, but the truth is, science has shown us that there's only one race, but people who are racists don't see it that way. And this was certainly, unfortunately, more of the majority than the minority during this period of time. So we're going to look at people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was incredibly influential, and he wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk, and he was also a supporter of the Pan-African movement, which was the idea of Africa as a continent coming together as one nation. And it's a dream that a lot of people had and still have, where Africans can find a place, Black people can have a place where they feel at home. Unfortunately, Africa is very, very divided for a lot of reasons, and we won't get into that in this course. But in any case, this idea of Pan-Africanism was very popular. So one of the artists who sort of exemplified those ideals was this artist here, Meta Warwick Fuller, and she emerged during the declining years of America's Gilded Age, which was a time when the wealthy did very well, and more women were being trained as artists than ever before. And she completed her formal art studies at what it's now known as the University of the Arts, but back in 1899, it was the Pennsylvania Museum School of Industrial Art. And when they say industrial art, they don't mean like you go off to a factory and you make art. Industrial art was kind of the term for applied art, for graphic design, for things like that. So in 1899, she went to Paris and she studied sculpture and drawing at the École des Beaux-Arts, the School of Beaux-Arts, and she met Auguste Rodin, who didn't like her drawings but loved her sculpture and said she needed to continue in that vein. And what she is famous for, this is a sculpture that you will probably see referred to in a lot of places, Ethiopia Awakening. And what you're looking at, actually, the color photograph is a little tiny miniature of it that I took at an art exhibition that was at. Where was that? The Woodmere Art Museum. But the real statue, the completed one, that was like an artist doing a sketch. You make a small sculpture and then you make the full size thing. So as you can see, the black and white photograph is actually of the full size piece, which is a bit bigger than life size. So anyway, she came back to Philadelphia in 1902 and unfortunately had a fire in 1910 that destroyed her earlier work. But this piece survives, Ethiopia Awakening. And so this was sort of, as I said, this idea of Pan-Africanism. A lot of people at this time were referring to Africa as Ethiopia. It was something that seemed to be, I don't know, just a collective term for Africa, and it also got sort of infused with the idea of Egypt as well. And there's a Christianity in Ethiopia called Coptic Christianity, and there's a Coptic Christian biblical prophecy that Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God, and was basically reviving Christianity in Africa and in other places by adapting it to indigenous African cultures. So you see, we have this statue that looks very much like somebody arising out of mummy wrappings, and that was the idea. And it's a female figure as well that's arising up out of these mummy wrappings. So we also have, as we saw in the last chapter, American artists wanted to prove themselves, and so that continues through this period more than ever. What we'll see after World War II in part two of our slideshow is there were so many artists that were living in Paris during World War II, and art was threatened. The freedom of the artist was threatened in Paris by the Nazis, and so many of them came to America. And so after 1940, we see this shift in the art world from Paris to New York City. So that's coming up. There was a group of artists known as the Eight. They refer to them in this slide and then never talk about them again in your book, and they weren't black, so I'm going to move on. All right, so this is important because this show that is referred to in this slide, what you can see here, it looks like a huge, huge space, and in fact it was. This was held in the Armory in New York City, the 69th Regiment Armory, and it became known as the Armory Show. This was assembled in 1913, and it had 1,000 artworks by over 300 artists, many of whom were European, and this was very, very contemporary work, very abstract, a lot of it cubist, very modernist, and America was not quite ready for this. So the audiences and the critics either thought it was awesome or made fun of it. And so we're going to see how that plays out for American artists during this period as well, because what it did is it made people think, huh, if they weren't making fun of it, they were thinking, hey, there's another way to make art. I don't have to do exactly what I've always been told to do. I can do something a little bit different. So we also have in the 1920s the growth of African American culture and this idea of the new Negro. So this was a decade of continued economic prosperity, rapid industrialization. There was a sense of optimism. We also have at this time what becomes known as the Great Migration, which I will get to in a moment, trying to kind of get through all of this. There's a lot to talk about. So, this new Negro idea is used at the end of the 19th century and moves into the 20th to show social and economic improvements since slavery. And it shows us a new racial pride, and that is expressed in economic independence, culture, and political militancy. And there were two sides to this. One comes from Booker T. Washington, who was the founder of the Tuskegee Institute, and he felt that it was important for Black people to have industrialized training. Things like car repair, plumbing, becoming electricians, basically working in what we now call the trades. And it was more important, he felt, for Black people to gain economic independence and thereby gain self respect, and by not having to shoot very high for things like trying to become a doctor or trying to become a lawyer. So he felt that economic self reliance was much more important than working on social equality. He felt that economic independence had to come first. On the other side of that is W.E.B. Du Bois, who I mentioned before. He was very opposed to Washington's idea. He felt that political action and racial equality were due to Black people. And so they are two opposing camps on the subject of the new Negro. And as I mentioned, there's this notion of the Great Migration. You're looking at a part of a series that was done by Jacob Lawrence that I will come back to about the Great Migration. And this is basically where hundreds of thousands of African Americans migrate from their rural, mostly agricultural homes in the South to the urban industrialized North, where there's more job opportunity, there's better not as much racial discrimination, and this lasted from 1913 to 1946. And as I said, the historians call this the Great Migration. And I think that's possibly, and yeah, that looks like another from that same series. So we have rising expectations and economic boom that comes out of both world wars. Unfortunately, war can sometimes boost economic prosperity in the country that's not losing. And that combined with overt racism in the South encouraged a lot of African Americans to go north, and a lot of newspapers at the time were encouraging them to do so. At the same time, let me go back for a second, there's also a huge influx of immigrants from Europe. So there's just kind of it's a lot of people coming around at the time. This is also known in the 1910s and the 1920s as the Jazz Age. So it was a time when alcohol was outlawed because of temperance laws. And so you have people making liquor illegally, bootleg, it's known as, and establishing speakeasies, which are basically establishments where alcohol was sold illegally. And life in America and in Europe was about urbanism and the towns. The clubs were listening to jazz, which was rooted very much in African American culture. And in three cities, Harlem in New York City, in Chicago, Kansas City, and also in Europe, the scene resembled what you're looking at in these three renowned paintings by Archibald Motley, who we'll look at much more closely. So you've got the Jockey Club, Dans la Rue, which is in Paris, and then blues. And jazz began in the South and spread its way up to the North and the West. As I said, took its elements from African music. And then primitivism is something that was influencing artists like Pablo Picasso, and it was the cultural crucible for modernism. If you've taken my African American art course, you've probably heard me talk about how looking at African art had a major impact on Picasso, and then in turn, all of the artists of that era, because by looking at African art, they realized again that there is a way to make art that doesn't rely on realism, that you can have abstraction, that you can take it on in another way. but they were also romanticizing African culture and belittling it at the same time, calling it primitivism. Yeah, and also Picasso, I don't think admitted until much later that he had taken inspiration from African art. So, also, as I mentioned, in spite of the fact that there's less racial discrimination in the North, it's of course still persistent. And Paris was very attractive to young African American artists and writers. And so there was actually by the 1920s enough Black American artists in Paris to make what the artist Hale Woodruff called a Negro colony. And they hung out, they talked about art, they looked at the new modernism, the abstract art, which of course was inspired by African art. And the Negro colony did not go unnoticed. The Parisians were very fascinated with Black arts, with culture in Africa, the United States, and the Caribbean. And the foreign critics praised their work. And, unfortunately, this came to an end with the economic depression, which was worldwide and caused a lot of artists to, have to go home because they might not be able to get back over there. And then with World War II, um, America's just a better place to be for a while. So I'm going to let you guys read some of this on your own in the PowerPoint section. So I'm going to go over that. Photography. In the last slideshow for chapter 2, we saw the daguerreotype. So over time, photography develops when they discover how to take those images from the daguerreotype and make a negative. And then you can make multiple images and a variety of different things. You can put it on paper. It's not as expensive. It's not as dangerous to do. And so African American photographers, just as they took on the daguerreotypes and embraced that as a means of making a living, we also have a lot of African American photographers embracing photography and using it to document the lives of African Americans living in America. Um, James Van Der Zee, who I mentioned earlier, he did that photograph of the Black Yankees. He was largely self-taught. He lived for almost 100 years. He maintained a studio in Harlem for almost 50 years, and he used a lot of props in his studio to show economic prosperity and education, and he also would use the things that people were wearing themselves and the cars they were driving to emphasize that. And so by doing all of this, he would also rework the photograph. He used special effects. And so he kind of helped create the period. He didn't just document it. So this is one of his most famous photographs. It's an outdoor scene in Harlem, and this is actually two people in their car on a Cadillac wearing furs. So it's called Couple with a Cadillac. And for a long time, he remained unknown. And then in 1968, he was kind of rediscovered and he was given a retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And then this is one of his photographs, which is kind of interesting. So look at it very carefully. He's employing studio props and he's also using a special effect. So it's called Future Expectations. You can see it's a young bride and groom. And then if you look over here, there's a little girl. So he's using the double exposure to make her look a little bit ghostly, but it's kind of like, this is what the future holds for this young couple. And then this is just another beautiful photograph, beautifully composed, of a lady at the piano with a very elegant looking cat. Oh boy, okay, lots and lots of talking. Again, I'm going to let you guys read this on your own. What I'm going to move on to is talk about artists working in graphic design. So, what's interesting about the Harlem Renaissance or the Negro Renaissance is it was predominantly a literary movement where we have, people like Aaron Douglas. Oh, wait, Aaron Douglas is a visual artist, but he became an illustrator to illustrate the images that African American writers were publishing in magazines like Crisis, Opportunity, Survey Graphic, and Aaron Douglas came to New York in 1924, where he became friends with a lot of the big names in the New Negro movement, like W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke, and also the writers, so Countee Cullen, Langston Hughes, and then there were also white supporters of African American art at this time. Albert C. Barnes, the Barnes Museum in Philadelphia was named for him, and that is his collection. He was very supportive of African American painters. We'll talk more about him, and also Carl Van Vechten. And Douglass had started out, we'll look at his work, his more portraiture work later, but he did a lot of realistic work, a lot of portraiture, and he created an abstract African style. And so for the illustrations that he did for the New Negro, Alain Locke called him a pioneering Africanist. And so this is part of 10 black and white drawings. This is called Rebirth, and you can see it's very flat. It's very graphic. There's no tonal values. It's simple black and white, lots of patterns, lots of flat shapes. And this piece actually led to lots of commissions that he was doing for covers of magazines, for playbills, for books. And this is one of the series of paintings that he did called God's Trombones, Seven Negro Sermons in Verse. And it's juxtaposed with text so that in the book, there's a sermon that's written as verse, and then there's an image to go along with it. So the sixth sermon, Crucifixion, doesn't show the traditional icon of Jesus on the cross. Instead, it's showing Simon, who carried the cross when Jesus was no longer able to do it. And it's a hierarchic composition, which means the most important figure here is actually is Jesus, but the largest figure is Simon carrying the cross. Jesus is over here with a halo, and you can see the profile of the gentleman of Simon is made to look more African. And this is also very typical of Douglass's style, which he called his Africanist style or Egyptian style, where he's got, just like in the Egyptian tomb paintings, you've got the face is in profile, but the body is frontal, and the legs here are kind of frontal too, although they could be profile as well, maybe. So in any case, the black historian, art historian David Driscoll said that Simon was a black man who took upon himself the yoke of Jesus' cross in order to relieve him of one last earthly misery. And so very beautifully this is displayed. And then there's also these spears that are functioning like arrows to point at the cross and point at Simon lifting, hoisting the cross for Jesus. And then this is another image of his aspects of Negro life, the Negro in an African setting, and Egyptian form, that's what he talked about. So this is where the figures are silhouetted in profile with the eye rendered from a frontal viewpoint. And we'll talk more about this particular painting a little bit further on. And this one too. These were two pieces that he did together, but I talk about them in more detail later. So I'm going to move on to look at some other painters. And basically, Alain Locke and W.E.B. Du Bois were urging painters to try to create a new racial art, to take their inspiration not from the white traditional art academy, but instead to look to Africa and African life and African American life for their inspiration. So Palmer Hayden became one of them. He started out doing seascapes that became pseudo-naive style genre paintings in the 1930s. And then Archibald Motley, who was doing very academic portraits, much like Aaron Douglas, he changed those into modernist genre paintings. So the 1920s was kind of a transitional period for these artists and other artists who were trying to think about, okay, what is the new Negro style? What is it we want to convey? So Palmer Hayden established his reputation as a painter of land and seascapes, as I said. And in between going into genre painting, he painted this still life called Fétiche et Fleurs, which basically means fetish and flowers. We don't hear it as much now, but back in the day, the word fetish would often refer to African pieces like this. So it's basically a still life showing a Fang reliquary statue and cloth made by the Kuba people of the Congo, and he's arranged them just in a traditional still life. And then Archibald Motley studied at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in a curriculum that embraced realism, portraiture, landscape, and genre painting. And in 1913, these students saw the work that was at the Armory Show that I mentioned earlier, and they made fun of them as examples of the starved alien minds of modernist painters. And I'm sure Archibald Motley did not foresee that he himself would take on some more modernist twists to his work. So he started out doing portraits like this, and even here you can see he is uplifting the idea of African American home life. This is his own grandmother, Emily Motley. This is called Mending Socks, and that's exactly what she's doing. And it's both at both times a portrait of his grandmother, but also a genre scene, meaning a scene depicting African American middle class life. And this was also kind of in response to a painting that was done by a white painter, Whistler, who had done a portrait of the artist's mother. And she's sitting in a rocking chair and she's wearing this big lace collar and blah, da, 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 da. So here is kind of a response to that from an African American perspective. And he painted professionally while he was still a student. And during that time, he won the Harmon Foundation Gold Medal for the Octoroon Girl. And hopefully, you guys by now might have viewed the film that I posted on D2L under Movies for Class. It's called I can't remember what it's called, but it's about the Harlem Renaissance. I think it's the only movie in there right now, and I would like you guys to watch that because you're going to have an assignment to go with that. And this painting, he considered other than Mending Socks was the best portrait that he ever painted. And the Harmon Foundation was very supportive of African American artists, which you'll see in that film. But in any case, this is called The Octoroon Girl. And he, at this point in his career, was very interested in tackling ideas about the biology of race and a preoccupation with skin color. And of course, that's never terribly far away from ideas about class and slavery. And so he's exploring that in these earlier works. And then on occasion, he would also depict more rural Southern working class African Americans. This is the Dipper. And so now, if we compare these two, looking back at this one, she's got more of a dark background and also a background that has details to it, such as there's a framed picture in the background. She's obviously on some kind of fancy sofa, whereas the Snuff Dipper is very starkly contrasted against the white backdrop, which is actually very similar to a lot of paintings that were done in the Renaissance to highlight the sitter rather than the background. And it's, basically he's showing the same details that he showed in his middle class portraits. I'm getting my cat because she's trying to jump on my lap. Here's my cat. She's going to get impatient in a moment, aren't you? So listen to my art history lecture. So anyway, he's looking out at us and he's commanding our attention and he's conveying dignity at the same time. Yeah. So he lived in Chicago. He was beyond the scrutiny of people like Locke, and so he was painting at the time exactly what he wanted. And he painted more portraits than any other American artist of the time. And again, he was very interested in the middle class. So the next artist we're going to look at, and we're going to look at him in kind of two junctures because his style changed from time to time too. Any artist who has a long career, their style is going to change. You can't expect people to just paint the same thing over and over again. Hale Espaccio Woodruff is one of these artists, and he became very important to representing African American modernist art in the 20th century. He also met Du Bois, he met Countee Cullen, the writer, and he started out as a graphic artist, like Aaron Douglas had. And then in 1927, he traveled to Paris and he met Henry Ossawa Tanner and other members of the Negro colony that were living there at the time. And he was very influenced by the Cubism that was going on at the time, as you can see in this painting here called The Card Players from 1930. And for a lot of American artists, they were pretty much imitating Cubism and also Cézanne. And so with Cubism, what they're basically doing is breaking up space, sometimes in a very geometric way. They're kind of flattening it out into shapes and color. So here we have the card players where you've got obviously, you can see the figures in this. Sometimes it's not as obvious, but you can see the figures of people playing cards. Um, and it looks a lot like the cubism that is going on at the time. And then later on, he switches gears completely and paints this, Mutiny Aboard the Amistad, but it's not from 1839. Oh my God, Dominic. It's from 1939, but we'll come to that later. So I'm actually going to stop here so I'm not wearing you all out. And I will go on. It might be a part one and a part two to this slideshow because, like I said, this is a really long chapter. There's a lot to cover, and you can take it in chunks. So consider this the end to chapter 3, part 1.